Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Mara Velez, and I am the Executive Director of the Shelter Playgroup Alliance, and it is my great pleasure to have Dr. Eduardo Fernandez on again to talk about the life model. We wanted to have, because we had been involved in supporting Eddie launching the life model a couple of years ago. We wanted to also add to the conversation and provide Eddie with the space to talk about when is a copy more than a copy. So if you have any question, or if you want to look at the original webinar that Eddie provided on launching the life model, that is on our YouTube channel. We can drop the links. It's also on our website, along with the images and the original paper. So I think you probably, if you are here, you may already know Dr. Fernandez's work. He is, I think, prolific is not a sufficient enough word for his level of publication, and brilliance is one of the things that I can safely say describes Eddie's work, his thinking, and his academic rigor around data and around publications. So the animal welfare community is really is better for all of the work that Eddie does. So with that, Eddie, thank you for being here, and all you.
Thanks, Mara. Well, that was a heck of a little intro there. So thank you everybody also for being here. And I'm going to try to not spend too much time in the presentation itself. It's going to be about 40-45 minutes, leaving us with about 40-45 minutes for Q&A because I think the Q&A is equally important. And there's obviously been a few events. I'm going to cover those here in the presentation. There'll even be a little bit of atypical data that I'm going to show in the middle of it to cover some of what's happened recently. So I think many of you, if not all of you that are here, know about some of these events that have happened involving IAABC and some of the concerns about what's happened. So I'll get really into that. The couple other things I'll just say is that there's chat going on. It's being moderated. There's going to be lots of time for Q&A. I'm not seeing any of the chat during the presentation, but I really want to have as open and candid of a conversation as possible from all ends. So I certainly have my own opinions on this topic, and I'm leading this discussion, this presentation. So yeah, and if nothing else, I want to have a little fun with this too. So I've put in a bit of humor here and there. So let's get into it. Okay, well, when we talk about copies, certainly there's a lot of examples historically. We can go through some of those historical copies. Dr. Pepper and Mr. Pibb. Mr. Pibb, I guess, didn't get an academic degree like Dr. Pepper, but E.T. and Mac and Me. Uh, even J.D. Vance without a beard and Francis from Pee-wee's Big Adventure. I think Francis pulled it off better. J.D. Vance, I think maybe showed up to the wrong Pee Wee Herman showing, but you know, definitely some historical copies. So, what remains a bit of a question is what are we talking about when we talk about copying? What is copying? And the fancier word when we get to things like plagiarism, right? What is a copy and what is plagiarism? Well, let's take this directly from Oxford itself. This is their definition. And this is the kind of thing that you'll see presented to students on their website. So, presenting work or ideas from any source as your own, with or without the consent of the original author, by incorporating it into your work without full acknowledgement. So there is a nice link there. And in other words, plagiarism means taking ideas, not just copying words. That can constitute plagiarism. Certainly, plagiarism can include copying and pasting material, but especially when we get into this idea of intellectual plagiarism. If you're taking conceptual frameworks, the fundamental ideas of something, and not crediting them accordingly, that is what constitutes intellectual plagiarism. So let's talk a little bit about the life model timeline and some of these more recent events. I think this is important to note how some of these things occurred. So when I first presented the life model itself, that was in June of 2023. And in that same month and the following month, there were a number of discussions with IAABC about what was going to happen with that model, including discussions with IAABC. And in fact, I had sent them a draft of the life model at that time. These conversations were ongoing with the executive directors of both the foundation and membership. So Rochelle and Dot were involved. And the past IAABC journal director, Tiro, was also involved and encouraged publishing with IAABC. But by August, we made the decision, which again, everyone was involved in this decision. Hey, we're going to go ahead and publish this because Journal of Veterinary Behavior also expressed interest. And we said, we're going to submit this. And because it's important that we put something out, the first real animal training ethics model to get into a peer-reviewed publication. And that term, even in and of itself, of what constitutes peer review, will come up a little later as well. So the first academic peer-reviewed publication of an ethical animal training model, of a reward-based training model, which that was published in February of 2024. So just over a year ago, 14 months ago, that was published. These discussions still then kept occurring. So there were continued discussions with the IAABC membership director, Dot, about how to proceed, including what IAABC wanted to do with potentially removing Lima and potentially adopting life. So these discussions continued to occur. What is missing from this timeline is everything that happened between. So the last of these conversations really happened around November or so, where we were talking about, okay, let's talk to the board, let's do these things. Where do we go from here? So last month, when we had the publication of the free model, that absolutely blindsided me. And I knew nothing about it. There was no discussion at any time when apparently these things were happening. I was not informed. There was no collaboration. There was no mention of it in any way to me. And I think that that's important as well to mention that. So uh, this was just something that was done behind the scenes. Uh, IAABC membership at some level was working on this. People in the membership board were working on this. We can get into that a little bit later, but how that proceeded, I don't have a lot of. I mean, I have very little inside information about it. I know I wasn't. None of this was communicated to me. So let's talk about these two models. What are the differences, or more unfortunately, what are the similarities between them, and why is there concern for what the free model represents in terms of potential plagiarism of the life model? Well, if we see what they mean, I mean, the very obvious thing that you can see right from the beginning is the free model just immediately takes two of those terms of the life model and puts them right in there, functional and effective. But I'll go through each of those specifically. So that removes that. There's half the terms taken right from the life model itself. Then we can go ahead and discount reinforcing, considering how much emphasis reinforcement in general, the use of reward-based training is placed within the life model. That is really the essence of the life model. So not a lot left there for anything novel. All that's left for anything possibly new is enriching. However, there's plenty of problems here as well. So we'll get into that, each piece of this model itself. Okay, so when we look at what the model does in talking about functional, so if we go through each of these components in what they mention, their emphasis, with only brief reference to Cooper, Heron, and Heward, and the second edition of that text as well, is on functional assessment. However, functional assessment is never clearly identified other than to say it's systematic. So, but systematic how? Cooper et al. And the Life paper are clear in identifying function through quantitative data. So, for instance, functional analysis. And this will come up again in a little bit because there's actually a book chapter that I'll mention that myself and Lauren Novak worked on, that's under review right now. It's been under review for a few months now. And I'll mention that in a little bit, where we get deep into this concept of functional assessment and what that looks like. So, at best, what we have in what they talk about in terms of functionality and functional assessment and the importance of function is essentially a watered down echo of the Life Papers section, The Importance of Function. So, when they mention reinforcing, their section on reinforcing, they define reinforcement paraphrased through Cooper et al., again, the second edition, 2014 edition. They also once again emphasize function, as does the life model, as does most of behavior analysis when talking, all of behavior analysis really, when talking about the importance of function in relation to reinforcement. However, it's not clear they understand the distinction between respondent and operant processes or procedures. For instance, they invoke positive conditioned emotional responses with respect to reinforcers, which is something that is particular to respondent associations. So, therefore, how operant reinforcement is defined functionally. There's no real direct connection between the importance of reinforcement and function and the relevance of functionality in terms of how to define operant reinforcement. Additionally, they call functional reinforcers, this is actually basically an example, consequences that meet an animal's needs. That is not what function means with respect to operant reinforcement. Although certainly this is critical to welfare and behavior, it's not how we define operant reinforcement, nor is it in line with what they just previously paraphrased from Cooper et al. So what we have is a section that mostly identifies good welfare as necessarily equal to positive reinforcement. But that's neither how to define positive reinforcement or welfare. It's certainly an important component for both. I mean, positive reinforcement uh, it, it should is it's critical that we look at welfare with respect to positive reinforcement, but we don't define welfare as positive reinforcement. They are not synonymous. It's a bit of a problem if we do that. So, and this is detailed in particular in the life paper section, increasing choice by inhibiting less. So where I talk about this, where, for instance, as Gold Diamond and people like Joe Lang have talked about, you can in fact have coercive positive reinforcement. So that's an important part. If I use something like deprivation, so if I use some type of form of deprivation, I I remove an animal from an ability to experience something, right? So I keep a dog in a kennel all day, and then only let it out of its kennel for training purposes. So it's in the kennel 23 hours a day, let's say. And I take it out and I say, oh, but I only use positive reinforcement. Would I consider that non-coercive or coercive positive reinforcement? If I use food deprivation, to make some not great treats more reinforcing. Is that coercive positive reinforcement? Yeah, it's an important part that we need to discuss. And that's where the relevance of going beyond behavior and talking about the impact of welfare is critical. So it's another problem that happens with the way that their model discusses each one of these components is it treats them almost as distinct entities. Okay, so here we get to enriching. And finally, something new, right? Well, except they defined enrichment multiple ways, all of which ultimately make enrichment equal everything good. Now, to be fair, this is a problem with how many people describe and treat environmental enrichment. Is they treat it as, oh, it's always good and it's everything that's good and that's all it is. And it loses the meaning from a proper operational definition of how enrichment should be described, which has to directly connect to some empirical evidence of improvement in welfare as a result of introducing something. So enrichment, particularly in relation to welfare, necessarily means a tool, stimulus or event to produce empirically based positive change. So it's a tool, and we need to treat it as such. In relation to training and management, we have a largely definitive review of the topic cited in the Life paper. So I wrote a narrative review about this, training as enrichment, a critical review. So and enrichment happens to be I think it's possibly the thing I have published the most about in peer-reviewed academic journals. So I had a bit to say about it in the Life paper. The reason why I wanted to explicitly not introduce it as part of how we're defining the model is because of the fact that it often gets described in non-operational ways and watered down as a result that people just go, oh, I must be doing something good because it's enriching. And a point about this, in fact, Shay Kelly made a comment about this on Facebook in relation to a comment that was said about, well, what I like about the free model is they talk about enrichment. And Shay said, shock collar trainers say what they're doing is enriching. So this is one of the reasons why I didn't want to introduce enrichment specifically in the life model is because you will hear these arguments that people will say, well, I know my training's good because it's enriching. So where there can be a lot of really coercive stuff happening. Now, ultimately, their enrichment section then focuses on choice, which again simply echoes the life model. And that's in particular what I focus on with respect to something that may be enriching is talking about the introduction of choice. So for instance, if you look at the life models figure 2, the paper, and the increasing choice section. So the free model's entire section on enrichment seems to boil down to, oh, it's about increasing choice. So it's not clear to me how that's different than what we already introduced in the life model. And finally, their section on effective, covering the four components of their acronym for their model. It's one of the most difficult sections to try and comprehend. They define effective, as does the life model and others, in terms of having a desired outcome. But they then proceed to use the entire definition of functionally effective while sidestepping the actual use of those words. So the result is something that is a bit Mr. Pibb-esque. So they basically say, we're going to use the entire concept of functionally effective in how we describe the importance of being effective, except we're never going to call it the thing that you called it in the life model. They could have just avoided overcomplicating the issue by citing specifically in the life model in the published paper where I point out the particular simplified parsimonious definitions, distinctions between this function effect and then functionally effective, which is training ethically matching behavior change to its cause so that it allows you to bring in this importance of this welfare concept. So, but That wasn't done. So the final thing I'll mention about what's introduced in the free paper is this part they go into the pathway to positive behavior change. Now, this is where they introduce a flow chart. This is the paper's process for action. It's what honestly had real potential. So, aside from how much of their paper, their model, their framework plagiarized like the life paper, I thought when I looked at this initially, I thought, okay, here's something maybe that a trainer could use, except once again, each stage is arbitrarily described without a clear process. So, for instance, they talk about functional assessment again, but at no point did they talk about any type of data collection. So ultimately, what we are left with, we're just left with words like information gathering, but what information and how is that gathered? And assess plan. They talk about the assessment plan, assess plan, assess how. And finally, goal met. So right there in the model, they'll talk about, oh, the goal is met or goal unmet. By how or what? So all the points, they're simply words thrown at the reader. I mean, it sounds like it's doing something, but I'm, at least for myself, I was left with no idea how to do anything in relation to this pathway, to this flow chart. It ultimately came down to however anybody decided to describe or say what it is that made something goal met or goal unmet without any real clear distinction about it. So at best, what we are left with are that plans and presumably assessments should not involve positive punishment. So kudos, I guess. Uh, I'd like to say kudos. I guess I'd like to say it certainly is a step in a positive direction, considering this is also coming from an organization that has historically certified trainers that have used a lot of coercive methods. So at least they're saying, well, but you shouldn't use positive punishment. Okay. So that's the best of what I could walk away from their pathway, which again doesn't really do anything different from the life model and what I've stated in the past. Now, I really liked this table that Lauren Novak did an analysis through ChatGPT, had ChatGPT specifically, so had AI compare both models in terms of what's going on in the model. And what you can see as a result is an incredible amount of strong overlap that it's essentially just taking and the reasons why, the different points about what they're doing in terms of taking different things just directly from the life model. So that's interesting in and of itself. I think this is a really succinct, nice table that demonstrates why the free model is in fact intellectually plagiarizing the life model. So, and then I had to throw in my own little quantitative comparison. So what I did was take the free model, the total references they used, 22 total references. Not a lot, and that's one of the problems, again, with what's written, what they published there. IAABC published 22 total references. Five of those are just exact references borrowed from the life model. So a quarter of them, almost a quarter of them directly. Now, three of the references are modified references. And this is, by the way, me being generous. So when I mean modified, what I'm saying is they use the second edition of Cooper, Heron, and Heward's Applied Behavior Analysis text, whereas I cited the third edition, 2020. So it's still the same reference, it's just an earlier edition. And then three of their references are similar. So someone, whoever, because we don't know who the authors were, on their writing team did things like, well, you know, Fernandez talked about Popper 1985 when he was talking about the importance of terminology and making an epistemological statement. And you know what? we'll just go with Wittgenstein instead, and we'll throw that in. So they're making the same point, but using a different reference to make the same point. So the net result is that half of all the references of what already are pretty limited number of references, 11 out of 22, half of all the references are exact or near exact, which is not great. So I'll make this simple statement now, and then we'll get to some of what IAABC has had to say, and we'll talk about where we go from here. But I've said this to a couple people, but if one of my students had turned in the free paper as an academic assignment, I would have reported it for academic integrity violation. It is almost textbook intellectual plagiarism. So it's pretty bad. Now, here was IAABC's public response to because thankfully, I didn't make a big fuss about this to begin with. I'm still, unfortunately, this has happened a lot in the community. And so I guess it just didn't surprise me. But there was a pretty big public outcry, and there were a lot of posts and a lot of people tagging me in posts. So IAABC pretty quickly had a response, and again, really didn't take any ownership. I mean, I think there's important reasons why they didn't really take any ownership of it, but it's not, it doesn't really offer us much. It just says, hey, we hear you guys. But we take your concerns seriously. And then proceeded to, and I reached out to membership board members and got nothing. I got one templated response, version of this. That's all I got. Talked to people on the foundation side that I knew, and they knew nothing about this. So for those of you that may not know, there's two distinct entities at IAABC. There's a foundation side and the membership side. So the foundation side seems to have been largely unaware of what was happening, which is not atypical of what happens between those two different sides. So I can at least say that much. Um, so they're not mentioning anything about the life model. And it's hard to say. I mean, they're saying we're taking feedback seriously, but that generally means responding to feedback to which I haven't heard much about. And they certainly have not responded to any of my comment, or they haven't responded to me publicly or privately, aside from one email response that again was largely templated. Now, many of you probably all saw this. I just put this in. That's not 21 hours old now. This is 3 days old, 2 or 3 days old, which many people got pretty excited about, to say that so I think this is at least somewhat of a step in the right direction. So they said, hey, we published this on March 19th. And as of April 9th, they've decided there's a temporary retraction of the free model. Um, why is there this retraction? I think because there was such a strong response. I think because so many people were upset about this. And it's really, um, I was pretty, I don't want to get emotional about this, but I was really happy to see how concerned people were about what was happening with this and with me. I mean, I think this is not about, I don't want to make this about me, but I understand, and certainly it impacted me. It definitely did at a personal level, but it was definitely nice to see this. And it seems like that resulted in a retraction. That's pretty incredible, to see that IAABC actually responded in this way. Now, I responded to their post with this. So I think it's good to be hopeful. I want to encourage people to be hopeful. But in terms of what they said, even with this retraction, um, They didn't say anything about why they were retracting the free paper other than concerns. So they mentioned nothing about potentially plagiarizing the life model or any of that. Um, and they still have not said anything about who was involved as authors on that paper, which I won't talk about publicly here. So, but they mentioned nothing about the authors. Nothing has ever been stated publicly. They still have not said anything, and they still have not reached out to me. So no one from IAABC has taken any initiative to start a conversation to talk to me about this. Maybe they will in the future. I don't know. But for now, this is where we are. It's a pause. That's all we know. Is that pause to do something like let's go back, make a bunch of changes, throw in a bunch of references and say, see, it's all legit? I don't know. We are left with IAABC not taking direct responsibility, but I think it's still a cautiously hopeful message. Perhaps they do reach out and they do want to push real progress. But what I would say about progress, and this is a point, Mara made a really important, succinct point about this, that progress necessarily means doing the work. So you got to do the work to progress. So if IAABC wants their own model for whatever reason, if they don't want to adopt the life model, if they don't want to credit the life model, aside from a simple paragraph saying, "Hey, there's this that this person did," and then just proceed to take from that. If they want to do something beyond that, they got to build their own model. They got to do their own research. They got to get their own papers, provide their own references, do their own thinking on that. And I think it's going to require a lot of work. I mean, I don't think, I know it's going to require a lot of work because I know what kind of work it took to produce something like the life model. So I think that would be great to see them go forward and do that. Um, and I'm happy to be involved with that uh, because ultimately that's where I place the emphasis. That's where I want to see. This is meant to make our training and management world better. So it's not about me. I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about what makes these things better. So that said, okay, where does IAABC go from here? Where some of this is, of course, again, where I hope they go from here. Preferably, it starts with reaching out to myself and others. I would be happy, I would be delighted to help with legitimate adaptations of the life model. And I thought that's where things were going until that one day a few weeks ago when suddenly this was put out there, even though we had conversations going all throughout 2024 about where IAABC saw themselves going. It probably also helps to get options from others outside of their organization. Does that involve me? I would be happy to be involved, but it doesn't have to involve me. Again, I think this is not about any one particular person, certainly not about me. I think it's about putting something out there that does, in fact, progress how we think about animal training ethics and connect it academically. And I can't stress that latter point enough. We do have one of the things that I've heard in response time and time again to things like these different models, whether it's the life model or anything else, or people talking about animal training ethics. One of the responses I've heard commonly is ethics are ethics. I know what's good training. I know what's good for the animal. I know what's good. Ethics are ethics. I don't need anybody to tell me this. So, first off, that is anti-science rhetoric. That's the same thing. It's no different than saying, I don't need a doctor. I know when I'm healthy. right? I don't need medicine. I don't need data. I know what's good. Nobody needs to take my temperature. I know if I have a fever. I know. And I don't want to dismiss the importance, which there is importance in our anecdotal observations. But I do want to say that science is an important process of how we move forward with all things. And if you want to say that we just know what's good or bad ethically, and we know these things, and we don't have to have discussions about what these are, we don't have to define these concepts. I do want to point out there are a lot of people that use very coercive training and management practices in the world in every setting with every species of animal that is being managed by being managed by us. Every species of animal that I know of that we are managing is also in in one place by some people somewhere. They're using incredibly coercive methods. And if you ask those people, if you go and talk to, and I know most, if not all of you have had this experience, if you see the shock collar trainers, you see the people using prong collars, you see people using incredibly coercive methods, and they think they are doing good. They think that it is enriching. They think my dog loves me, so I know it's good what I do. And that's what you will hear. So this is why it's incredibly important that we have these discussions. So regardless of how IAABC proceeds, transparency and who publishes what is key. So the fact that publicly no information has been given on who authored the free model is at best problematic, and we still don't know. So I think that is incredibly problematic. And there is also probably it's this is a good time to mention and question how IAABC advertises their peer-reviewed journal. So it is not a peer-reviewed journal in any academic sense. It is an online magazine. It is not an academic journal. It has no international standard serial number, as far as I know. It's at least not advertised. So an ISSN, which is what every journal should have. So that's nowhere to be found on their website that I could find, nowhere that it's stated. There is no editor-in-chief or editorial board as far as I could discern. There's just a journal team. There is no transparency in the in that peer review process, so we don't know who the peers are. There's no clear editorial board. Again, a lack of transparency all the way through there. And you can submit your manuscript at any stage of the writing process. All of these things are, it's not that they're bad, but it is not what, it's deceptive to refer to what their online magazine, to refer to it as a peer-reviewed journal. That is not what is meant by peer review in the academic sense. Now, it's not a problem. I think it's a good online magazine. I think they've published a lot of really great pieces. I just don't know why they're not honest about what it is. Just call it. I, it's fine if you call it, it's the IAABC journal, but stop saying it's peer reviewed. Just call it an online magazine. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, I think the most simple and straightforward response is I'm hopeful, but I'm also, and as a scientist, I'm always skeptical of just about everything. But I think we should have some healthy skepticism of IAABC. So it's good for the reward-based community to hold IAABC accountable. And that includes the fact that this is the organization that did make Lima popular. So they are the organization that got this out there. It's good for us to remember, to hold them accountable for the fact that this model that was popular for and used as an example of reward-based training, even though the definition of Lima, the introduction of the concept, where Lindsay introduced us in 2005, is next to pictures of prong collars. So it was never meant to be something that the reward-based training community used to describe reward-based training. Sure, these things can evolve, but Lima has been problematic for a variety of reasons, all of which I talk about in the life model. That's not to say it hasn't done some good for the reward-based community, which I also express in the life paper, but it is problematic. And IAABC is who made Lima popular. So other things, other than continuing to hold IAABC accountable, continuing to be skeptical, critical of things that happen going forward, you can also write to the IAABC, including all of their membership board. And in fact, here's a handy little email that when you write to this email address, all board members are CC'd when you address this email. So board@iabc.org. And you have just sent an email to the entire membership board. And I can't emphasize enough. It's really, it is all of you that helped create this pause. So, which I'm incredibly grateful for. So keep on voicing. I think these are important discussions. I think it's important for us to be critical. And it had an effect. So it's also to be mindful that, this is another question, other thing that I've heard people have talked to me about is, well, but, I get my credentials from IAABC. Where do I go from here? I'm not, you can consider there certainly are other options. Um, in the least, I want people to be critical of IAABC. What people decide to do with that, that's their own decision. But if you're looking for needing credentials, there certainly are other options. I know many of you probably already know this, but I guess it's worth mentioning some of these things. These organizations rely on your money to provide such credentials, which means you have the power to hold them accountable. And both the Pet Professional Guild and the Animal Behavior and Training Guild have fully adopted the life model, which, in my biased opinion, is a great start, I think. So that's great. CCPDT also offers credentialing options, so I think those are important to know. Um, okay, well, couple little slides left here. Moving forward, um, well, how do we move forward? Well, I think the reward-based training community should look to be vigilant of its own behavior. I think this has been a good thing. So that includes pointing out when organizations themselves engage in questionable behavior. And I think this was a pretty clear example of an organization engaging in and unironically, unfortunately, in engaging in ethically questionable behavior when putting out an ethical animal training model. But I think it's good that we be skeptical of this and we keep them in check. In addition, part of how we move forward is building better bridges for everyone. It's what I've tried to create an academic career about doing, because my side of things, where I must, even though I know I'm part lots of things for lots of stuff, but I am very clearly a scientist and academic. So I'm very clearly on that side, the university side, the ivory tower side. And we are terrible, even as an applied animal behaviorist and working with, I mean, I'm in a vet school, a vet and production animal school. Everyone, all of my colleagues were all doing applied animal work, and we're still terrible, um, for a variety of reasons at really having an open communication with practitioners. So I have tried to build as many bridges, build more bridges for that, to give practitioners opportunities to get information to academics and academics to get information to practitioners. And that was a big part of what the life model was really meant to be. But that also includes practitioners with owners and guardians, right? So the ability to talk to them about these things, even. And certainly, I'm going to stress this last part, just like I've been stressing, academicians with all the above. That's really critical. So, and as an example, and I alluded to this very early in the presentation, Lauren and I have a book chapter. It's been under review for a few months. It's a text that a book that will be published, I think, at the end of this year or beginning of next year. These things can take a while to get published, the books themselves, with a number of chapters from, and it's on applied animal behavior and behavior analysis. So I'm really looking forward to this book. Lauren and I wrote this chapter for it, and the chapter is really expanding on training ethics in action. So we take a lot of what the life model presented and say, here's how we go forward with this. Here's what you do. Now, unfortunately, I've reached out to the editors of the book and said, "Hey, can we get a preprint out there?" And they've reached out to the publisher, so I'm waiting to hear back. So that preprint will, if and when it's available soon, I hope this next week. I'm just going to put it up there on ResearchGate. And I'll put stuff out there on Facebook, and anyone can then have access to it. And maybe that chapter itself will be useful for IAABC going forward. I hope so. I think it really expands on a lot of the stuff introduced in life and does so without if for some reason you're averse to acronyms, we cite the life paper and we talk about the same things and we present the same figures in it, but we really make it more as a treatise of ethical animal training and how to go from theory and science to practice. So ultimately, progress looks like scientists and practitioners working together, training organizations being transparent and accountable for their actions, and a community that is willing to collaborate and build concepts and practices together. And that last point I could not emphasize enough. I am always willing to work with other people and collaborate with other people as long as the end goal from everyone's perspective in that, everyone's intention in that is to improve the lives of animals. So that's what I'm looking to do. Okay. That said, thank you very much for letting me talk here for an extended period of time about all of this. I think I went a little longer than possible, but we still have plenty of time for questions and easy ways to reach out to me. Some of the references cited in the paper, places to find a bunch of my papers, my web profile, et cetera, et cetera. And with that, I don't know, Mara, Yona, if you want me to keep this up, the sharing mode, and we can go back to slides, or you want me to stop sharing. It's up to you all.
I think leave this up for a little while. There's a number of questions, and Yona's gonna manage those questions, and I'll keep track.
Sure.
All right, so we have quite a few questions and comments. The first question we have is from Mel. I'm actually going to combine two of her questions because they look related.
Sure.
They says, considering this is not news to many BIPGM folks in the industry, so sorry, they them. How do you cope with all of the white noise that continues to demand coddling of these pretty overtly colonial leaders slash orgs, which we know only reinforces these kinds of problematic behaviors? Later, Mel says, maybe too personal, but do you truly think it's possible to, under settler colonialism, for a settler colonial entity to truly practice accountability, um, After 12 years in both, I have never seen true with an asterisk accountability in animal training or vet med yet. Below true for me must align with indigenous slash nomadic ways of healing. That's my bias slash personality. The colonial individualism and supremacy culture make it extremely difficult for white or white assimilated peoples to practice accountability.
Yeah. Look, this is I think it's an incredibly important uh, issue. We got to get better about talking about it. And I'll give a couple simple responses to it. I know it's hard to have a simple response to this, and simple is not something that is um, always all that useful for an incredibly complicated topic. But um, do I think anyone um, in the organization in IAABC was, I mean, let's just talk about the facts first. This is a largely white board, white group of people, and I am certainly um, uh, look, to be as straightforward as possible. I mean, I'm a Latino academic. Um, it's something I've taught. There's very few of us out there, and it's disheartening. I don't think anybody had an intentional um, uh, attempt to do that, but the problem is how much of that stuff is really intentional. How much of the constant um, discrimination, the microaggressions, the how much of any of that is intentional and at any level. Um, so whether we're talking about um, misogyny or any form of discrimination, really, any type of racism or discrimination. Um, so it's why I think, particularly when you're in a position of power, people have to be sensitive about these issues because it's tough. I mean, there's a thing that a lot of my friends in similar positions and I would talk about this too, that when you grow up and I know, and I guess this is worth mentioning too. Look, I've got my own sets of privilege. I mean, I'm I don't suffer from colorism. I happen to be one of I jokingly say I'm whitish. I'm one of the 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 um the uh more whitish of my family, probably the most. And that itself brings about a certain amount of privilege. Um and I'm a middle-aged dude, which is certainly and when I moved to Australia, there is no Latino minority out here. So I made a lot of jokes about, I don't know what I'm going to do with all this white privilege that I get when I move to Australia, um, because I had no other way of how to interpret this, and it's really been an interesting ride because of it. So, but there's a thing that a lot of my friends, a lot of my colleagues that have to deal with the same kind of um, hurdles that you have to deal with in this space, which is to say, look, as a Latino academic in particular, I've had to work twice as hard to get half as far. It is the game is rigged, um, ultimately, and so I'm sensitive, incredibly empathetic and sensitive to the issue of the fact that we have these systems that it seems like you're just charging at windmills sometime. That there's no way to disrupt that system. I don't want to say that those systems don't have the possibility to change, though. I don't want to say, regardless of what the history, how they've embedded, I have to believe that we can change those systems in some way that does um, may make them more aware, make them more sensitive. So I think this is an important topic. It's not one, and if it's not obvious, this is also. I grew up in a very traditional Cuban immigrant household. uh, we didn't draw attention to ourselves. And that's another very common response of many people that grow up in immigrant families is when these kind of things come up, we go, yep, keep our head down, keep our head down. Like we don't need to draw attention to ourselves because of the level of discrimination that you will often suffer as a result of people judging you by even just your name. So um, it's not a comfortable conversation necessarily for me to have because of how much I've been trained to not, but I try to have this conversation and I think it's possible to make these changes. And I think it's nice to be aware in some way. I've stopped friends of mine when they're doing something, people I know that when they're doing something that I consider to be in some way a microaggression or just straight up discrimination. And I say, let's talk about that for a second. And I want you to know how that makes me feel. And it's incredibly uncomfortable for me, but I think it has an effect. So I hope that this is, probably spent more time talking about this than I would normally. I'm telling you, I think it's an important conversation. I think it's good to be aware of. So thank you.
All right, great question. All right, so next question is from Christina. Christina says, thanks for taking us through this. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on the inclusion of negative reinforcement in the free model.
Yeah. Do they? I don't know that they ever say anything. And we could have a much, much bigger conversation about negative reinforcement and how it's been described, especially in relation to coercion, because um, the conversation has largely, when we talk about negative reinforcement, the term has been hijacked by uh, coercive trainers, by people using, because then they can say, oh, look, I'm using reinforcement. And it's like, no, what you're doing when you're choking, shocking, pinching a dog or any other animal is you are using a ton of punishment and then a little bit of negative reinforcement. And that little bit of negative reinforcement is the release of all the aversives that you use to punish all the other behaviors that can't happen because only this one little bit of behavior can happen. So it is possible to use negative reinforcement in ways that is not coercive. It is what I will say about that. It is that it is incredibly difficult to use negative reinforcement in non-coercive ways, and that's a part I think has been missing from this conversation, is because first we need to understand that negative reinforcement can be done in a non-coercive way, but then we also have to fully acknowledge it is incredibly difficult. And it's one of the reasons why I've talked about the use of contrite aversives. If you are using contrite aversives in any way, you're almost certainly using coercion. So I have a paper published on the use of negative reinforcement uh, with uh, uh, petting zoo sheep. And this was the stuff that predated cat. This was the stuff that, so we did this 2000, 2001 as an early graduate student. And the thing was, so CAT being the constructional aggression treatment, and I won't get into anything with that either. But what we did with the sheep, these are sheep that the keepers, the staff could not get anywhere near them. They ran away anywhere, anyone got anyone near them. And I can remember I happened to be reading one of the issues of Clicker Journal, I think it was, and I ran across Alexandra Kurland's article about she was talking about doing some stuff with some, I think, alpacas or llamas, and how she couldn't get close to them, so she clicked and then left and turned away. And we had tried everything with these sheep. We couldn't get anything. And I read that article and I remember running into Jesus's office and saying, "This is how we're going to fix the sheep." And so that's exactly what we did was we used as a negative, we paired a negative reinforcer with the click of the clicker. And the negative reinforcer was we figured out what baseline level the sheep would let us get to, which was not very close. And as long as they didn't run away first, they had to turn around and face us. I think the first step was not running away, and then it was turning around and facing us, something like that. We clicked and we left. So it put the power of making us move, us leave in that was now up to the sheep. And within a few trials, by like 2, 3 sessions in, the sheep started, it was a mother and her son that we targeted for this. They were two Jacob's four-horned sheep. She started moving towards us. That is technically a negative reinforcer. I don't think anyone would look at what we did. It was very clearly beneficial to the sheep. I don't think anyone would look at what we did and say it was coercive, but it is described as a negative reinforcer. So, all right, that's probably more than you were looking for, but so this is I don't know what the free model or would say about it, but I just wanted to bring about the importance of understanding, and this is why it's important to understand the impact of these procedures on welfare as well. So, but what we're actually talking about when we're talking about these procedures, because how something is defined behaviorally may not match up to, and it's why we use terms like coercion and coercion and non-coercion itself. That you can in fact have coercive positive reinforcement, as I described, and non-coercive negative reinforcement, with the stipulation for the latter that I will say it is not easy and not likely to be able to use negative reinforcement in a non-coercive way, but it can be done.
Hey Eddie, there's a number of questions about sort of how to move forward. I know that you spent a bit of
Yeah.
time talking about it. So some of the questions, one of them was maybe not asked in good faith, but um, can you just help differentiate what a witch hunt is from what you're trying to do here?
Hmm.
And then
Okay.
the other piece is around ask in actual good faith around moving forward, um, gentle pressure. I think you acknowledge that IABC is retracting, they're regrouping,
Yep.
and all of those things are positive. Um,
Yeah.
so I just kind of talk about that, and then also um, talk about um, sort of what maybe not what you're doing because you may not want to, but what are like specific legal type actions for you,
Hmm.
maybe not specifically, but for
Yeah.
someone who discovers that their IP has been um, plagiarized.
Yeah, yeah. So let's address the first, and you could remind me of these as let's address the first part, the witch hunt part, which I'm happy to discuss. I think it's important. So to me, if we try to operationally define what a witch hunt actually is, it means looking for something that doesn't exist in some way, right? That's in fact the idea of what a witch hunt is you are accusing people of doing things or engaging in some kind of action that they did not, right? Or putting some blame on someone for something they didn't do. So I would distinguish what I've done here from any type of witch hunt. I think maybe I would have another operational definition that might be what this person was alluding to, which we could talk about what I've described as pitchforking, which doesn't have to introduce anything in terms of validity of any statements, but just means rousing people up to do something, right? Good or bad. So, pitchforking, usually, I use the term certainly derogatorily to say, oh, well, here we go. Here's the community's pitchforking again, or this is happening again, or we're seeing pitchforking, and the internet is filled with lots and lots of pitchforking. So, I wouldn't describe any of this in any way, shape, or form as a witch hunt because I hope I provided lots and lots of evidence in here, including some quantitative data from a couple different perspectives from a few different perspectives about the ethically questionable behavior that's happened. So I think I would hope that's pretty clear. Is it pitchforking? Well, I am saying people can reach out to IAABC. I've also stressed that it's important, I think, that we hold organizations accountable. I don't think, and I'm asking everybody uh, to think about what they're saying and providing people with information rather than blindly go into a rage about what's wrong here and what needs to change. And I also would dare say that I think I've been um, pretty kind to IAABC in all this, considering um, I still have not been contacted in any of this. There's still been no acknowledgement of any of the wrongdoing, and it's pretty clear it's wrongdoing. And there was an open line of communication happening before they did the wrongdoing. So, um, I think I'm being pretty kind also. So I hope I do encourage people to reach out to IAABC. Is that a form of pitchforking? You know, I don't want people to do it if we include in that operational definition in a blind rage. I do want people to be thoughtful, but I think it's important that we hold the organizations that we are giving mo our money to, that you all are giving your money to. I think it is incredibly important that you hold them accountable. So, yeah. What were the next two parts that we had there, Mara? We had,
I think you addressed them, Eddie.
yeah,
It really
okay. Oh,
is.
the legal part though was
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Um, I think the legal part, look, there's nothing I'm doing at this point. Um, uh, the So Karen Overall, Dr. Karen Overall, editor-in-chief at Journal of Veterinary Behavior, had sent out some messages and had some communication with IAABC, which was, and she CC'd me in a bunch of the stuff because she was aware of what happened here. And I I got a couple chuckles out of some of it because I was getting CC'd in some of this, and there was some. It was amusing, and Karen is not somebody to trifle with. Boy, I I would not want to. She was. It was amusing. But and Karen had a lot of advice to give me, a lot of nice advice. Really thankful. I mean, she's a wonderful editor-in-chief over there with Journal of Veterinary Behavior, a wonderful veterinarian and research scientist. And she's been around. She's seen a lot of this kind of stuff. Um, I'm not taking any legal action. I don't think that does any good. Um, I want to see positive change from IAABC. I want to see good stuff that they do. I'm hopeful that they move forward in a positive direction from here. And I think me trying to hold them legally accountable for anything doesn't benefit anybody other than me. So, not at this point. I guess we'll see what happens going forward.
All right. Thank you for that. Next question. I'm going to combine two questions that have to do with both IABC and CCPDT.
Yeah.
Folks are involved with these organizations, doing volunteer work and have credentials, and they're wondering, like, with these questionable actions and things that have also come up with CCPDT regarding possibly including balance trainers and in what they're going to be
Mm.
doing going forward. Do you have advice on weighing options and what are the ethics for us as the credentialed people? Should we be getting these credentials? Like, should we be helping out with these programs?
Yeah.
People are wondering about how personally to move forward.
Yeah. By the way, I decided to stop sharing. I think everybody's had enough on the final slide there to take down any information, but I can't give it really a lot of great advice. I'm certainly not probably the best person to answer things about credentialing in general. So whether you do or don't, or where you're going. Um, I can just say some things about how you interact with the organizations themselves and how you do, which is I I can't stress that enough. They rely on your money. So um, you can you should hold them accountable for those things. So I think, and they should listen to you. I think it's important that you keep them in check that way, and I would say that for all organizations. Um, I think they should hear your voice when if you. I think it's incredibly important that we say things like, "Hey, you need to have an anti-coercion, anti-punishment statement out there." Because otherwise it lets people like, do you want to get credentialed by the same organizations that someone using choke chains or shot collars or prong collars is using? I don't, I, I don't think so. And I think that's also, I don't want to be I strongly encourage people not to be jerks to other people. I strongly encourage people not to go around and start being jerks to other people, that practice what we preach, to focus on the reward-based stuff. But that doesn't mean not holding people accountable, not holding organizations accountable for the actions they've engaged in. You can just do it in a way that's not being a jerk, but you can say, hey, that's not acceptable. By the way, that's hurtful for those people, for me, for those animals. So, and here's the evidence we have to show that. You can do that in a way that is not um, mean. It's just true. It's factual. I tried to do that in the life paper when talking about what is ethical and what is not. And you saw very different responses and how some people responded to that. There's still a website out there. I'll let people find that on their own if they so desire. But there's a guy out there that went full blown after me because of the life paper and was asking people to message the chancellor and of my university and etc. Right? So yeah. Um, you can see very different approaches to how to handle some of these things. Um, so I think we have to hold people and talk to and hold them accountable in organizations. And it's one of the reasons why, in this case in particular, I've said reach out to the IAABC board. But I do want to encourage people, uh, if you are going to reach out to IAABC, if you are going to post things about this, if you are going to say things, do it in a kind, respectful way. I mean, just the fact that IAABC is probably going to be more likely to respond in turn uh, if you are in fact saying, here's my concerns, and do it in a way that I think is constructive. So, yeah. but I think it's important that we hold the organizations accountable for what they are willing to certify. And we do demand these things. And we're at this point. This is a turning point. I think this is an incredible turning point right now for the reward-based training community. We are at a point that we can say you don't get to use coercion anymore and call yourself a reward-based trainer. I think that's where we're at. And we don't support organizations that support non-reward based training methods.
All right, thank you. So next question from Suzanne. Suzanne says, I also saw a caveat in IABC's approach. This looks like a quote. Practitioners may work with caregivers who are already using aversive techniques or dot, dot, dot. Suggest that this framework might be designed to accommodate those who are hesitant to fully transition away from aversives. What do you think?
So sorry, can you say that? Maybe I missed that. Can you say that again? I'm not sure I
There was
fully.
yes, they saw a caveat in IABC's approach stating
Mm.
practitioners may work with caregivers who are already using aversive techniques or tools.
Right.
Um, what do you think about them possibly using this as a way to accommodate those who are not ready to fully make that jump?
Um, yeah. I I don't know. It's hard for me to say what that I mean, is IAABC turning a corner on the use of aversives in general? It seems like it. I mean, I think it's worth saying that if there's one thing they did in pushing this forward is they said, hey, don't use punishment. Is that a little bit of a like, are they saying, I mean, you can work with people that work with punishment? Or work with people that use coercion or I don't know. It's that's hard for me, especially as an academic, as it's hard for me to say what it looks like for you all, or for many of you with your boots on the ground, what that ultimately looks like. I mean, I know, like, I can't, uh, let's, I can't not, I run into people all the time. I have colleagues, academic colleagues, people that I have to deal with veterinarians. I have people handling animals. This next week, I'm going to be working with students training goats, and I have other people on our campus that will get the goats to the practical, to the practicals that we're running, where I'm training students to train goats. And I've seen not great handling techniques and had to report it in one case. Does that mean I just say, no, they can't use, I can't allow those staff to ever touch the goats again, or I can't allow the students to go anywhere near goats that have been handled in this way, or like, and that's just with me with limited. So I guess I'm sympathetic, maybe even a little empathetic to not telling people you can't, that if somebody else is using these methods. I think putting the emphasis on what people are doing and who you're certifying for their actions themselves is a critical element. So I'm glad to see that it seems like there's a turning point there for IAABC. And I hope that's true, and I hope that's where things progress. Um, but in terms of allowing people to work with people that don't do those things, I don't know. That's hard for me to say.
All right, thank you. Mel has another question. How do you feel about potential collaborations to analyze life with a decolonial lens?
I'm open to it. I'm certainly, I think it's important. So I think. I think that it would be good to have something out there. I think just talking about how to deal with organizations in general that already have that level of privilege, which is kind of a an organizational issue altogether. I think that's important. So what does that look like? So yeah, I think so.
All right. So, Eddie, Dr. Fernandez, gracias. Um, this has been, I just want to address some of the kind of feeling in the air about why even do um, a webinar like this on plagiarism and and call out an organization um, on this from my perspective. And in full disclosure, I was at one point in time on the board of the IABC, the membership side. And I think that it's really important for any organization, any person who is engaging in wrongdoing, which this clearly was, and being vocal about it and being polite in the same way that Eddie is being polite yet direct about why is this even plagiarism? How does this, and what do we do moving forward? And I think it's really important for all of us to consider that polite tone, being very direct, being fact based, which is what Eddie has done throughout all of this. And I know that for some folks, it brings up a little bit of emotion or threat. So we saw some of that. And also, and thank you, Mel, for kind of lifting up some of the privilege. Um, both Eddie and I are quite privileged, being light skinned, and yet there's still quite a bit of race covers everything. So I just want to kind of address that. If you don't know what that means, there are lots of resources to educate yourself on that. So, um, and I think in the chat, I just want to also address the that somebody felt like they were being silenced. They made their points. I've asked them to politely stop repeating themselves, essentially. And that is certainly my right and my privilege as the moderator and host of the webinar. This is not a public space. I'm not a government organization. Just want to kind of put that out there also in terms of what censoring actually looks like. It's not that. So just want to be real clear on that as well. But on a very positive note, Eddie, you are amazing. I am continually in awe of the your energy and brilliance in publishing and moving the animal welfare industry forward, and helping me reframe my thinking around welfare and measurement and all of the things over the years. So I, from a personal perspective, appreciate you tremendously, and also from an academic and animal welfare industry perspective, appreciate you tremendously. So thank you for being here and doing this and continuing to publish. And I'd like to thank everybody else as well, so much for taking the time out of your day and joining us.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.